When you mentioned the rejection of universal truth, and you also mentioned in your paper that at the same time they're asserting universally applicable critiques. Could you explain a little bit or expand a bit on that?
Yes, yeah. So let's start with decoloniality theory, because, so as I said, that comes out of dependency theory, which is, as a school of Marxism, it is a universal theory. They're trying to state principles which are true across the board, which can be confirmed by examples all over the place. And so there's a grand narrative there, essentially, which is about how the world is made up of these regions which are in an exploitative relationship with one another. And then it prescribes a remedy for that, which involves economic separation. Now, decoloniality theory, it wants to keep on that grand narrative. And indeed, that is always touted by the decoloniality theorists as what distinguishes their theory and makes their theory better than postcolonialism. So they are quite critical of postcolonial writers like Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak, and other theorists, and probably Akhil Mbembe as well. People who actually want to get away from having a grand narrative, a grand universal narrative of history or a sociological narrative of the way the world works. Decoloniality theorists do want to maintain a grand narrative, but at the same time, they want to delink from Western epistemology. And it's actually this overlaying of a kind of somewhat postmodernist approach to truth and objectivity, so criticism of objectivity and universalism, overlaying that upon a theory which has roots in universalist Marxism, which creates a big tension, the tension which you noted, in fact, at the heart of decoloniality theory. Because when they talk about delinking from Western epistemology, Walter Mignolo likes to talk about there being no truth without parenthesis. In other words, any claim that something is true or something is factual or a value is legitimate needs to be put in inverted commas or bracketed. It's true relative to a particular context of utterance, the context of the West, if it's Western epistemology. And he says one conception of what time is might be true for the West or valid for the West. He likes to use the example of time, the concept of time. He says that when the Spaniards colonized the Andes, they imposed their conception of time. So again, associating a concept of time with a particular ethne. And he asserts that the Andean conception of time of the indigenous people of the Andes was something very different, but their conception of time was colonized by the other. There, he wants to assert that both of them are right, though they apparently disagree, both of them are right, because one of them has a conception of time which is true in parenthesis relative to the European or West European context or ethne, whereas the other is true or valid relative to the Andean context. So that raises a problem because we have this grand narrative about how a colonial matrix of power involving the coloniality of power, the coloniality of knowledge, which I've already mentioned, and also what Nelson Maldonado-Torres calls the coloniality of being. And that is a system which describes the whole world. So it's just like the Marxist vision of economic exploitation. It is meant to be objectively true for everyone, everywhere. And that obviously raises the problem. I thought there was no truth in parenthesis. Or why don't you tell us, Mignolo, which ethne, which part of the world, which regional identity group that grand narrative of the colonial matrix of power having been put in place and staying in place for the past 500 years is true relative to? But of course, they don't really want to do that, Mignolo, Grossfogel, and the other decoloniality theorists, because they want to maintain that grand narrative. And so there's a tension there between maintaining that grand narrative of the colonial matrix of power and their assertion that, as Ndlovu Gatsheni likes to say, everybody is born into valid and legitimate knowledge systems. In other words, all the different knowledges are true and they're true in parenthesis. It's difficult to maintain both of those positions at once.